So let's begin with the nervous system. Okay, the nervous system structurally is fairly simple, but you do need to know these first two terms right off the bat. Okay? We divide the nervous system structurally into what we call the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is two structures that are a single unit. Okay? Two structures that are a single unit. Central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And in medical situations, you will hear this often. You won't hear people talk necessarily separately about the brain and the spinal cord. You'll hear these three letters, CNS. Oh, we've got a CNS problem, or there's CNS difficulties, or whatever it might be. And you know that they're talking about the entire organal structure of the nervous system. Brain and spinal cord, you can artificially separate them, but they are one structure, intimately tied together. It's like one big thing. But we can separately study the brain or separately study the spinal cord. It's one big object. Okay? That's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system then are the nerve structures that run throughout the human body. We've studied many of these already. We've looked at a lot of these nerves. We've dissected them out of the cat. We've talked about them in lecture. You know, the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, sacral plexus. All right, those are all parts of this nerve structure. So there's a PNS, peripheral nervous system, and a CNS, central nervous system. Okay, so again, just to review, central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And these are the major processing centers. This is what you might call just generically thinking. These are the active thinking parts of the nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, which includes two sets of nerves. Cranial nerves come directly out of the brain, and spinal nerves then come directly out of the spinal cord. These then are the wiring of the system. Okay, the nerves are connecting various parts of the human body to the central nervous system. So that's your big kind of layout for the whole system. At this point of those four things, brain, spinal cord, cranial, spinal nerves, we've studied quite a bit already about spinal nerves. Okay? But we've got really a lot to do with the other three. And as I said, we're going to do brain and lab. But look, we want to get this big general picture of the nervous system. So I like to typically start the lectures by talking about the cells that make up the system. Okay? As you and I know, and I've said this many, many times, I'm alive because my cells are alive. I am a cellular organism. Everything I do is a cellular process. And so if we want to look at the nervous system, there are going to be cells within the nervous systems that are literally what you might call the actors, right? These are the things that make it happen. They do it in concert with one another. Now, the cell that we're talking about most often here in the nervous system are the neurons. And you remember right from just about day one, I gave you pictures of cells, right? You remember this? Remember the picture of a neuron that we had? You couldn't see the entire neuron. You could just kind of see where the nucleus was and the main part of the cell. Our picture was about like that. It had several branches running off the picture somewhere. Right? So what we want to do now is look at the whole neuron and think about what this thing does as the main functioning structure of the nervous system. We need to know or be able to label three major parts in any neuron. Okay? So the first part that we would want to recognize is what is called the cell body. This would be the main structure. This is where the nucleus is, ribosomes, mitochondria. Remember Golgi? Remember that? I'm trying to find 3 Golgis in that picture. All right, cell body is the main location, the main part of the cell. Now, all the branches that you see coming out of the cell then are one of 2 types. The first type that we want to locate are the dendrites. And there are often multiple dendrites. Not always, but often. Some kinds of cells have many dendrites, some have few. Dendrites are described as the receiving fibers, or maybe not fibers, but this receiving processes, receiving parts. You see, a neuron is going to function in many ways like the whole nervous system. In fact, the whole nervous system kind of reflects what's going on here. A neuron is going to receive impulses and signals and data from other neurons. It's going to collect all that information that it receives from other neurons. It's going to make a decision. It's going to process all this data it's receiving from another neuron or other neurons. And it's going to take all those things into account, and then it's going to send its own signal off somewhere. Okay? So dendrites will be the receiving fibers. They're usually short and close to the cell body. And then you will find in a neuron a sending fiber. This is called an axon. And these can be quite long. The deal is, though, that you'll find only one axon coming out of a cell body. Now, that axon may split into several branches further along, but coming out of the cell body is always just a single axon. So the neuron is not sending multiple signals or different kinds of signals. It's always taking into account all of the data it receives, and then it's summarizing all of that, and then making its decision and sending its signal on to another location. This could be the neuron that's sending a message to the muscle fiber. Remember that? Remember how we were just talking about muscle fibers? Remember the neuromuscular junction? Right? Where the chemical that's released from the end of the neuron here stimulates the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. And then we have that whole conduction system, releases calcium and causes actin and myosin to contract. So this is the sum total of things, right? Receiving, processing, and sending. You know, if you think of it like a computer, anything that sort of, quote, thinks, functions like this. You take data in, right? This is like input. If I have a computer, if I have a laptop, if I have an iPad, if I have any kind of device, right? It just sits there, not doing much until I interact with it. I give it some input. It takes my input into account, like I might type on a keyboard, or I might swipe with my fingers on a screen, or I might move a mouse. But those are all input. Those things mean something. Within the computer, there is a whole set of circuits that are already programmed that if I do something here, it's going to do something there, right? So there's sort of a computing thing going on, a processing, thinking. And neurons are built the same way like a computer. They are pre-programmed. They are pre-designed to do certain things. If they get certain kind of input, there's going to be a certain kind of output. So my whole nervous system is this, right? How do I know what I know? Everything I know has come through my senses, right? The senses of my human body take data from my world or even from my own human body and feed that into the processing structures. The processing structures are pre-programmed in many ways to respond in certain ways. And then all of that is affected out through the muscles of my body, the muscular system. So, computers, nervous systems, and right down to cells function in this way. Okay, so I want to see, more than anything, there's not a lot of remembering to do here, but more than anything, I want to see this theme, this pattern, this thing of input, processing, and output. And I'll see it over and over and over again. Now, we're just showing you one kind of neuron here. This isn't, neurons come in lots and lots of variety. Let me just show you 3 basic neurons. There's many, many more than this. Okay, what just happened? There we go. Okay, so there's many, many more than this. Here are the 3. Okay, this one here to the left over here is very much like the one we were just looking at, with many dendrites and a single axon. This is called a multipolar neuron. The poles being the number of fibers that are coming out, the number of processes that are coming out. So when you have many dendrites, it's a multi, it's a many. Okay? Multipolar neurons are obviously going to take lots and lots of data and bring it in, and they're going to respond to lots and lots of data. These tend to be the motor kinds of neurons. And by that, you're going to hear the word motor a lot as we talk about the nervous system. Motor refers to output, okay, because everything that comes out of my nervous system works my muscles, and motors are working things. So the word motor has been used for these multipolar neurons. If that's multipolar, what do you think this one is right here? This is, how many things do you see coming into the cell body? 2. So this is bipolar. Anybody here bipolar? You functioning all right? Take your drugs, you'll be fine. Yeah, no, this is a bipolar neuron. You can see there's not as many dendrites. There might be several branches, but all the dendritic information comes in through one major channel. And as before, there's always one output. This tends to be neurons that we would put in between the others, kind of ones that are not the output, not the input, but what we call interneurons. Like. Now this one over here on the side is very interesting, isn't it? What is missing here? Yeah, so here's an example. You don't want to say every cell has dendrites. Why does this cell not have dendrites? What would I not have if, see, dendrites bring information into here, then something happens here, and then data goes out. So I'm not going to have, if the information doesn't go into the cell body, I'm not going to have thinking or processing, right? What this is going to be a straight wire. Whatever comes in here at the receiving portion is going to be funneled straight through to wherever the next destination. It's not going to be filtered. It's not going to be processed. It's not going to be changed in any way. This is like just a plain wire without any thinking in between. See, neurons, quote, think. Not in a creative way, they're processed. It's like any sort of machine. If you give it certain input, you're going to get certain output. But if those are motor, then these are sensory. Where do I interpret what I feel? Do I feel things with my fingertips? If I cut my finger, does my finger hurt? Yeah, my finger literally does not hurt. If I cut the nerve between here and here, I wouldn't feel a thing. I would not feel what's going on here at all. Because all that happens is certain stimuli here in a fingertip is routed straight up to my brain, and my brain figures out what it is. Now, the brain does a very interesting thing and projects the pain back where the stimulation is coming from, so that you know where to look to fix something. And you think your finger, oh, that really, really hurts. But it doesn't. Not literally. All of that pain is an interpretation going on inside your brain. But what I need in that sensory system is I need for this data to get straight to my brain without any intervention, without any processing, without any of the rest. So the cell body is here, but it's really just keeping this one giant axon together, keeping it alive, keeping it functioning, provide it with its raw materials. This is just a straight-through approach to what's going on. Yeah, Paula?
So if I understand this right, so sensory is like touching something or hurt your finger.
Correct. Sensory is input,
Okay.
right? What I see, what I hear, what I touch, what I smell, what I taste, basically.
Okay. And then motor, what would be like an example?
Motor is output, like I'm moving my finger. Why is my finger moving? Because something up in my brain decided that the finger should move and is sending a signal out to the muscles here to cause this to move.
So like if I'm thirsty, like I put some water, that would be motor?
Any action is motor.
Okay. And then,
Sensory is input, motor is output.
okay. And then what would be the bipolar neuron? What would be that?
What would be a bipolar? That would be an example of some neurons that are in between. I take the data in and now I've got to interpret it. So I'm going to run it through a bunch of circuits in my brain that aren't sensory, that aren't motor, literally, that aren't bringing something in or sending something out. There's got to be a lot of in-between neurons in the brain and the spinal cord.
So maybe like if you're studying or something? Would that be like an example?
Yeah, like, okay, you're not moving a muscle, so there's no motor output. You've got your eyes closed, but you're still thinking, right? There's still things going on inside your mind without a lot of sensory data. You might be tuning out the world, so you're not focusing on hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, right? You're focusing on other things that are going on. You're wondering about something, right? So it takes a whole lot of neurons to do that kind of processing in there. So this is a dramatic, major theme in the central nervous system, or within the whole nervous system, is data in and processing that data, all the thinking stuff that goes on, and then actions coming out. And so there are separate, you don't have a neuron that has information traveling two directions. Neurons are always one-way streets. So the sensory set of neurons are going to be the one-way streets coming into me. The motor neurons are going to be one-way streets going out of me. Okay? Okay? So really, we want to make this point that the whole nervous system is reflected in a single neuron. I've got input, right? I've got the processing, and I've got output. So my whole nervous system is built like this. when I'm thinking of the whole nervous system, I use those words we've just been describing: sensory, right, processing, and motor. So these are the terms I would use, with maybe a single neuron. When I'm talking about the whole nervous system, I'm using this language that you see down here. Okay? So, each one of these neurons has its own role to play in the whole picture. Right? Now, what you need to begin to imagine then is billions of these neurons interconnected with one another. Right? Just a very simple way to look at this. Here would be two sort of simple circuits. I may have places where neurons take in a whole bunch of different data, but begin to congregate that data into some sort of single response. But likewise, there might be other places in my brain where a single thing is spread to various parts of my brain so that I get some interpretation in a number of different places. There could be places where neurons feed back on one another. I get a signal traveling along here, and then one of the branches of this axon feeds data back into this, which may stimulate this more, stimulate it more. They could go on and on and on. And obviously we can't show you or describe all the various pathways that can be here. There are going to be millions and millions of different ways that neurons are connected to one another. It's going to be very, very, very complicated. The amazing thing is all of this then finally results in things like thinking, right? Or wondering. Right? How do a bunch of cells all beep, 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 talking, stimulating one another, wind up in you thinking about E equals mc squared, or, anything that you think about or wonder about or try to understand? How do your emotions come about here? What is going on in the neurons of a brain when you feel sad, or you're happy, or you're anxious? All of this is neural interactions and responses. Every skill you have, every ability, all the things that you've learned to do, riding a bicycle, walking, playing a piano, typing on a keyboard, using a pencil or a pen to write with. All of this is somehow these complex sets of neurons interacting with one another. And at very, very, very complex levels. And it's just, it's an incredible thing, and in many ways just kind of beyond our understanding. Now, neurons, although they are the number one cell in this whole picture, they're the ones that are really doing all the work. They can't do it alone. Neurons are so highly specialized to do what they do. They need a special chemical environment. They need a special situation, different from the rest of the human body. We're going to talk about this and emphasize this more. You actually have two worlds in your human body. You have your general average world for most of your human body, and you have a very, very special chemical, separated, isolated location for your central nervous system. And it's up to a number of cells to help out with that. The support cells, or the helper cells in the nervous system, are called neuroglial cells. Neuroglial cells, sometimes abbreviated to just glial cells. You might hear this as well. Neuroglial or just glial cells. The glial cells provide a number of functions that neurons cannot supply themselves. In the central nervous system, there are 4 types of glial cells that are very important to the whole picture. First of all, there are astrocytes. Astrocytes are cells that provide a basic support or scaffolding sort of structure for organs like the brain and the spinal cord. The neurons are just these flimsy little wiry things. If you put a bunch of them together, they would just kind of lay flat. But you need, if one neuron's going to connect to another and this one's going to connect to another, you've got to have something holding all of these little wires in place. And that's what the astrocytes do. If you look closely at this picture, you can see the cell body of an astrocyte, but there are little processes that go off in a number of directions. And they're going to hold maybe 3 or 4 or maybe even a dozen different parts of a neuron in just the right place so that everything connects where it needs to. And it's going to provide the structure that holds them in place. Astrocytes really have 2 major functions. One is that sort of structural, these are the structural cells. But notice that some of these processes run out to the blood vessels that are providing for the neurons, right? There's obviously going to be lots and lots of capillaries in the nerve structures. And notice that these astrocytes then take a portion of their cell structure and wrap them around the capillaries. So the capillaries wind up with 2 cell layers around them in the nervous system, central nervous system. So when the plasma carrying nutrients and gases and all those important things, when they come out of the capillaries, they're going to have to filter through 2 layers of tissue, 2 layers of cells. The epithelial cells of the capillary, but also then a layer of structure of the astrocytes. And what this is going to do then is make the fluid that ultimately comes out of the cardiovascular system special. It's going to adjust it. It's going to say, oh, you can't get through the capillary walls and into our special place here. And other things may be brought in excess. If there's certain kinds of substances that are needed by the nervous system in greater quantities than other places of the body, then these cells could help do that. So this is going to adjust the fluid that is coming out of the cardiovascular system and create a very, very special fluid for the central nervous system. And that's going to provide important nutrients and materials that are needed. So when you think about astrocytes, you want to think of these 2 things. They are the support structures of the central nervous system, and also sort of the specialized, I put the word nutrition here, it's probably a little broader than that. It's all the substances and the right amounts of the substances that are needed by the neurons of the central nervous system. Remember, these capillaries are what we call continuous capillaries, so they don't have junctions. They're not fenestrated capillaries that just leak, right? So the fluid that is produced here is going to be carefully controlled. Now, there's a second major thing that is needed by neurons, and that is insulation. The ogliodendrocytes are the insulator cells. If you look closely again, we've got a single cell here that has little extensions that go off, and they create a big flat structure that wraps itself around the axons. Remember, the axons of the neurons are the long fibers. If one part of my brain is connected to another part of my brain, there's an axon that's leading from one location to another. So I've got typically my cell bodies, my dendrites over here, But they're all pretty much clustered close together. The axon, if a signal needs to be sent to another location, it's the axon that's doing that. If you have a bunch of axons together and there's an electrochemical signal traveling down it, it's probably a good idea to insulate that so signals don't crisscross from one axon to another. It's kind of like this building. This building is fairly new. If we went up in some of this conduit, we'd find wires up there. I'm hoping they used wires that have insulation on them. They would probably have a lot of trouble if they didn't, because things that carry electrochemical signals can short circuit across there. So there are many, many ogliodendrocytes throughout the nervous system which are covering the axons. Now, cell bodies and dendrites don't typically need that. Cell bodies and dendrites are going to be held by the astrocytes into locations. All their little connections are right. But when you have axons running long distances, they're thin and they're usually side by side with one another. And it's just a good idea if they're insulated. So ogliodendrocytes do that. A third type of neuroglial cell is called a microglia. The microglia are not white blood cells, but they function like white blood cells. When you think of white blood cells, you think of the defenders of your human body. Well, it turns out we have this high security zone. The central nervous system of the human body is physically and chemically separate from the rest of my human body. And even white blood cells cannot get into this area. So the central nervous system has its own set of security. And these defensive cells, these ones called microglia, are wandering around in the central nervous system like white blood cells would be, looking for infection, taking care of problems. And then finally, the fourth type are called ependymal cells. Ependymal cells. The ependymal cells are the ones that help initially produce the fluid. The fluid that is produced for the central nervous system comes from these special cells, and these cells help to circulate that fluid through the system. The difference between the astrocytes here and the fluid production cells, these ependymal cells, would be this is where large quantities of fluid are produced from these cells and circulated. As the fluid circulates, as various neurons take resources out of the fluid, something has to recharge that. So the fluid is flowing by the astrocytes, by the capillaries, and so they are continually adding resources to the fluid as it moves. So there's initial production of the fluid, and there's an ongoing recharging of the resources into that fluid. The fluid bathes the system, and the fluid then nourishes the entire nervous system. In just a little while, we will talk in more detail about this fluid.
Can we go back to the microglia? So they're the
Sure.
defense cells, but so what are they protecting against exactly?
Any sort of infection, it's very, very tough to get infections into the central nervous system. But if they did, these would defend against that. If cells expire, if an astrocyte dies and you got a little bit of debris hanging around, kind of like white blood cells, it's going to help clean that up.
So, like, for instance, if someone gets like brain disease or like cancer in the brain, it means the microglia is not working properly.
You know, cancer is a whole different kind of thing. What's interesting is cancer, any sort of brain cancer, spinal cancer, is always going to be in your glial cells. neurons lose the ability to reproduce. You basically have as many neurons as you're born with. Now there are, with extreme trauma or injury, it is possible for the brain to produce extra neurons. But on the whole, no, once a neuron grows up and gets into place, it's there, and reproduction is never a part of its future. They just don't reproduce. Whereas these cells, these glial cells, can reproduce. They have the ability to go on and make more of themselves. And that's all cancer is, right? Is an uncontrolled reproduction of cells. So any tumors that you find in the central nervous system are 99.9% of the time glial cells, gliomas. You'll hear that as a general term for brain cancers, spinal cancers.
So they're their own cells, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, these are their own cells.
Cancers actually stem from the glial cells?
Correct. Neurons are one kind of cell, an astrocyte is another kind of cell, an oligodendrocyte is another kind of cell.
But if we have the microglia to help defend the glial cells,
Right.
how does the cancer grow then?
Just like anywhere else in the body, you know, with white blood cells throughout our body, well, we still don't know for sure what goes on. But I believe this, and I think this is right, that we all have little cancers all the time. You know, that there are, with trillions of cells in our human body, there are constantly cells that wig out and that start to reproduce uncontrollably. But white blood cells are able to identify those, catch them early, and destroy them. It's only when your immune system is a little depressed and they're not on their game and cells multiply to a size that individual white blood cells can no longer damage that, and then that mass gets out of control, and that's what we finally identify as cancer. It starts at a cellular level. If it's handled at a cellular level, white blood cells can keep cancer in check within our human bodies. But if they get out of control, then you get in trouble.
I think I saw a statistic somewhere that said the average person gets cancer 6 to 7 times a day, but the body fights it.
Right, but white blood, yeah. And that's becoming more and more the norm in most people's thinking is, yeah, you know, a cell is not perfect, and any little thing that throws it out of whack, if it gets into sort of a reproducing, you know, cycle where it's, you know, something isn't controlling it anymore, it's just uncontrollably reproducing. But apparently white blood cells, some of our white blood cells have the ability to identify and destroy that cell. And so it's only when our immune systems are not healthy that these things get out of control. The other interesting thing here is that you have 10 times as many of these cells as you have of neurons. Neurons are the actors. But if I look at brain substance, right, 90% of this is glial cells. 10% of this is neurons. And yet, the neurons tend to be a little bit bigger than some of these glial cells, but still, I have billions and billions of neurons as well. So, this is a huge, complicated structure. This is why when we talked about tissues, we usually think of tissues as being a single kind of cell. This one nerve tissue is kind of just a big conglomeration of all these different kinds of cells. This is complex down at the cellular level. Okay? So, let's look at the helper cells then in the PNS, peripheral nervous system. So there are 4 in the central nervous system. Now there's only 2 in the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is not anywhere near as complex as the central nervous system. In fact, if I think of the peripheral nervous system, basically 95, 98% of the peripheral nervous system is just axons. Okay? There are a few cases where we have some cell bodies of neurons that are not in the central nervous system, but about 98% of all cell bodies of neurons are in the central nervous system. My motor neurons have their cell bodies in the central nervous system. It's the axon that courses out through my body, forming the nerves that actually connects to my muscles. One of the few places where I find cell bodies outside is in the sensory neurons, right? Hopefully you can recognize this as a unipolar neuron, right? And this is what is typical of a sensory neuron, where you take the sensory data and run it straight into the central nervous system. So you've just got, in a sense, one big axon. But how does this cell body then survive in the general environment of my human body? How does it survive? Well, satellite cells help that. What satellite cells do is they come around and form themselves in a little wall-like structure around the cell body and give it a sort of mini environment. They protect it from the normal environment. They, like the astrocytes do, letting only certain materials from the cardiovascular system into the central nervous system. These satellite cells surround a cell body and isolate it from the rest and give it its own little mini environment that is identical to what you would find in the central nervous system normally. So cells that live outside the central nervous system need something special too. Satellite cells provide for that. But as I said before, very few cell bodies of neurons exist outside the central nervous system. This is one of the few examples. So we have satellite cells for the cell bodies. And then secondly, we have what are called Schwann cells. Schwann cells are the insulator cells for the peripheral nervous system. Let's put some Schwann cells here on this axon. Remember, we don't need insulation on cell bodies. We don't need insulation on dendrites. We need insulation on axons that travel long distances. And especially out here in the peripheral nervous system, we have some axons that are very, very long. Even longer than the other long cells that we were talking about. You remember when we were talking about muscle fibers? How long can a muscle fiber be? Right? Very long. If it's as big around as a football, it could be up to 3 football fields long or longer, right? Well, let's make a neuron the size of a football. Let's make the cell body the size of a football. Okay? The axon then is going to be about as big around as maybe a pencil or a thick pencil. How long could that thick pencil, that axon be? Maybe as much as 2 miles long. Okay, so the whole cell isn't that long, but the axon can be very, very long. I have some cell bodies up here, high up in the lumbar area of my spinal cord. Their axons are all the way down to my toes. Now, for something microscopic to have a fiber that runs over 3 feet in distance in my human body, and yet that thing is microscopic, we're talking about tremendously long things. And since they're all bundled together into a nerve, all these little axons side by side, the insulation of those axons is critical to their function. And that's what we see. So the Schwann cells are the insulator cells. Here's a picture, sort of what they look like. The cells are very interesting because what they do is sort of wrap themselves around and around and around and around, creating many, many layers of cell membrane surrounding that axon. It's a super insulation. It's kind of like any sort of little food thing, you know, like flautas, or, you know, you just take a tortilla, put some stuff in, you roll it up 3 or 4 times, right? Or crepes, if you like French food or whatever. But this is like a super crepe or super flauta with many, maybe as many as 50 or 60 or 80 individual layers of cell membrane wrapping around that thing. Okay? So in total, there are 6 types of what we call neuroglial cells. 4 of them found in the central nervous system, 2 of them found in the peripheral nervous system. And typically, too, you should know this term as well, the term myelin sheath. In medical things, you'll hear about the myelin sheath from time to time. That's this total insulation of an axon. Okay, a single cell is a Schwann cell, but the fatty substance that's in here is a fatty substance. It's a substance called myelin. And so that myelin sheath are all the Schwann cells insulating an axon. Okay, so when we talk about nerve tissue, we're talking about one big giant blend, right, of neurons and glial cells in these super complex formats. And somehow all of these neurons and their glial cells result in all of my cognitive abilities. My ability to remember, to think, to wonder, to feel. I'm amazed at things, shake my head at things, all my skills, everything is tied up in these cells. Okay? Questions about this? Any good?
Satellite cells, it could be for it to get its own biodome.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah, the satellite cells are completely separating that cell body from the rest. So no general chemistry of the body can get at those cell bodies. They have to be their own little things. So yeah, a little biodome, a little specialized environment that they live in that's apart from the rest of the body. You kind of have to live out in the body but not be a part of the body. So
So is it like it's like a protector?
kind of like a protector, separator, you know, kind of like maybe if in your house you didn't have a good immune system and you needed to put in a whole system of stuff in your house to create a special, infection-free environment. You know, there's infection outside in the world, but it can't get into you've got your own little special environment. Those satellite cells that surround that cell body keep it in its own little special environment.
So is there empty space between it? Or is it like,
There would be fluid, but it's going to be fluid made by the satellite cells, not the general fluid of the human body.
so it wouldn't be like a Schwann cell, like where it's totally insulated?
A Schwann cell, its only structure or its only function is to insulate the axon, right? The satellite cells are actually creating a little mini environment for the cell body so that cell body can do what it needs to do. It wouldn't get the right resources from the human body if it didn't have something helping it.
So with the satellite cells, but they don't have that in the central nervous system, right?
You have one giant environment for the entire central nervous system. We'll talk about that in just a second. Yeah. Okay? Everybody good?